Well, hello and welcome to another edition of the Llama Commerce Show. I'm your host, Brett Curry. Really excited to be back today. It's been a while. It has been too long since we had a Llama Commerce Show, but today
You're slacking off, man.
It's been busy. We had IRCE and then a big marketing push, and I've been swamped. But we're back and back in full form. Excited about the show today. As you can see, if you're watching the video, I do have a guest in the studio today, Mr. Rob Toll, Director of Solutions here at Classy Llama, and one of the very first llamas, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's been quite a ride.
Indeed. So Rob is here, and as always, we exist to demystify e-commerce into actionable bites. And today we're going to do a deep dive into Magento 2. Obviously, anybody in the Magento space has been thinking about, reading about, considering Magento 2. When is the switch potentially going to be right for me? What do I need to consider? What do I need to know about Magento 2? And so really, if you look at experts or people that have had hands-on experience with Magento 2, really your name would be on that list, I would think. And there's a handful of other folks at Classy Llama and a few other agencies that have really been inside of Magento 2 more than anybody else. And so today I'm just going to grill Rob with question after question. It's going to be like an interrogation. What do we need to know about Magento 2?
So we'll tell you all about the new hotness.
Okay, good. So anyway, just as kind of a precursor, Rob, if you would give people just a quick background, like of your evolution, because I think that'll be helpful. I know a lot of people know you already, but
sure.
Kind of where did you start with Classy Llama? How did you end up as the Director of Solutions? And what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so I've been at Classy Llama, it's getting close to 8 years now, and originally started as a contract developer when we were a very young company, still working out of the founder's garage, and worked my way up, spent some time as a project manager, figured out that wasn't for me, but in the process identified this need that we had in our company for the role of what we call a solutions architect, which is basically the person who works between our business user merchants, who are our customers, and our technical people to figure out what we need to build for them in a Magento site. And so over the years, I've done that, been doing that for about 5 years now. And I now run a team of guys who do that. So there's a couple other guys that I work with on a regular basis. And we do a lot of pre-sale support, scoping out features, things like that.
Fantastic. But you got some development chops, so front end, back end, all of that.
Yeah, kind of back end, maybe stretching it a bit, but definitely some front end familiarity on the Magento. In fact, it's interesting because although I don't do development regularly, I had the opportunity to get involved with some work that our team at Classy Llama did directly on the email system for Magento 2, the email templates for that. We got to work with Magento on that core project, which was nice and allowed me to kind of get my hands dirty, so to speak, with the new platform.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so I think kind of to piggyback on that, I think it'll help folks as they say, okay, what perspective is Rob coming from here? Is he just like trying to sell Magento 2, which I know that's not true, but I was going to question that. So if you could just kind of lay out like what kind of Magento projects have you worked on? So you work closely with Magento on the email templates, but how many roughly M2 projects have you been a part of, and what do those kind of look like?
So thus far, I think we've done about 6 or 8 different projects, and there's been a variety. There's been a handful where we are helping merchants transition from Magento 1 to Magento 2 in some capacity, and then also a number of new builds on Magento 2, including some that are fairly lightweight, sort of standard Magento, and some that are more on the complex side. We also have a couple projects that we've transitioned midstream where we started development on the Magento 1 platform, and once we sat down and looked at timeline and Magento 2 was released, we said, we think it will make sense to go ahead and switch this to Magento 2 so that merchant's on the latest and greatest Magento offering when they launch.
Nice.
So
nice.
Yep.
Cool. So here's what I think we'll do. I've got a series of questions. Like I said, I'm gonna grill you and prod and just get the inside scoop. So we'll just kind of circle this topic a little bit. So maybe we'll hit it from a few different angles. We may bounce around a little bit, but I think in the end we should have a pretty good picture of an insider's perspective what M2 looks like. So let's just start with something basic. But what's new? So I know we can't go through the whole laundry list, but what's new and notable about M2 versus M1?
The most significant thing that's new about Magento 2 is the changes to the application layer or the architecture of it, which I know that's a bit maybe dev speak, but the things to understand are that Magento wanted to hit a number of key objectives that were major complaints about the Magento 1 platform. So Magento 1, for example, was difficult to upgrade. And with Magento 1, you would frequently get what in Magento space we call extension conflicts. So you'd install a couple of extensions from a couple different vendors. Those extensions would cause problems with each other. And Magento also wanted to improve the ability for people to make large-scale modifications. So maybe take out almost an entire chunk of the Magento application, replace it with something else, and then better coverage with the web APIs to help with integration with other systems, help with other people being able to build connectors to Magento, things like that. And just generally, they wanted to modernize and improve it. So we could spend some time talking about the development improvements, although I don't know how well that's suited to our audience here.
So people are driving, so we got to keep this lively so they don't drift off to sleep.
But here's the key takeaway. Magento 2 is much more standards oriented than Magento 1 was. It uses consistent patterns through more of the application, and it uses sort of well-defined structures between pieces of itself and for its external API, so that when you upgrade, things internal to the application will stay more consistent. Therefore, things will be less likely to break. And also, there's a whole new model for how you make customizations so that extensions are less likely to collide with each other. Now, there are some new features, and there are a whole lot more features coming, but that architecture shift is really the biggest gain that we are seeing with Magento 2.
Nice, nice. So in addition to the architecture change, I know there's also some improvements with speed and potentially reducing some friction in the cart and payment area. And any comments on those areas?
So when it comes to speed, Magento 2 has done a couple of things. They've brought the full page caching system that was only present in Magento 1 Enterprise Edition, and they've made it available in both editions of Magento so that users of the Community Edition can now benefit from using full page caching. The application is now also natively compatible with Varnish. So Varnish is a high-speed, what you'd call the edge-side cache, which basically is a way of making Magento scale very well and perform very quickly, especially when you're in sort of high-load scenarios. So you could do that with Magento 1, very heavy customization. Now it's built in natively. There's also
you want to maybe just, because I know you're really good at this, demystifying things and taking developer speak into. So if someone was out there saying, I don't really know what you mean by like the benefits of caching, and I certainly don't know what Varnish means, drill that down, dumb that down just really quickly.
Boy, how do I describe it? So if you think about, over here you have your Magento server, and then when people request pages from the Magento server, so they're browsing the site, all of those requests are hitting the Magento server, and then Magento has to respond with the appropriate page for what you've requested. What happens with something like Varnish or any other front-side cache is that you have your Magento server, and then you have a cache sitting between Magento and the user. So when a request comes in, the first time it goes to that Magento server, but when Magento passes the request back out, it gets stored in that cache. And so then when a user wants to see maybe the same page,
which if someone's listening only, Rob's doing this amazing thing with his hands right now that really does add to it. So you have to watch the video if you're listening only. So okay, keep going.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So if somebody wants to view the same page, their request comes to the cache, and they get a response back from the cache. And there's two reasons that really helps performance. One, the cache can respond very quickly. It doesn't have to do any calculation because it's stored what a page should be or what the component should be. Comes back very fast. Also, it helps with performance because many users are only getting to the cache layer and then getting the page they need, and their request never goes to the Magento server. So the server doesn't have to do any work to meet that user's request. And so fewer server requests on the server means the server has more resources. It can respond more quickly to the requests it does have. And it especially helps with scalability, right? Because if I have 1,000 users or 10,000 users or 100,000 users, the more users I have, the more likely that multiple of those users want to view the same page.
Yep.
So where without caching, without something like Varnish, I might have now many more hundreds or thousands of users hitting my Magento server. A lot of times the requests on the Magento server can still stay fairly small, and most of those users are hitting the cache. Really helpful in very high volume scenarios. You ever do something crazy like go on Shark Tank? These are technologies that would help.
We've seen that. Yeah, we actually had a customer who their site went down. Not a classic Llama development customer, but on the marketing side. Yes, yes. This was not a classic Llama build site. We were just helping with marketing, and they did actually. Their site went down for a little bit after being on Shark Tank, which was interesting. So really, that was the first time, maybe ever, we've seen cache explained via hand puppets. So that's good.
So you really have to watch the video.
Yeah.
Some stuff that's easier to get your head around, especially if you're not that technical user. Magento 2 has some real significant improvements to the admin. They've completely changed the admin experience.
Yeah, I think
it actually looks nice.
Yeah,
it doesn't look like it was built in the 90s now. And also, it's tablet friendly, so it's not fully responsive. Partly because I think, from many of our perspective, if you shouldn't really be trying to administer your e-commerce store on a smartphone. If you're trying to run your store from a phone, you're doing it wrong. But a tablet is a very reasonable device. A lot of business users use tablets now to do different functions, or even as their primary computing device. Magento 2 admin is now touch friendly, can be used on a tablet device, adapts well to that. So it's a huge improvement. It's also far more customizable. So many of the grids and views and filters that are there can now be tailored to different applications. So you can build out different views for different groups of people in your company. CSRs can see one view, people filling orders can see another view.
Awesome.
A business administrator can see yet a different view, quickly switch between different standard views. It's really helpful. There's also a whole new checkout experience, which is a really great improvement that streamlines checkout significantly. So in Magento 1, checkout was often 5 or 6 steps to complete a checkout process.
In some ways.
Super bad, right? Yeah. In Magento 2, that's been reduced to 2 steps. They've also moved customer registration from the beginning of checkout to after the checkout.
Which totally makes sense.
Big
totally makes
point,
sense,
right?
Yeah.
If you have customer registration at the beginning of checkout, you're asking a user to make a decision about whether or not they want a long-term account before they can buy. And you don't want to have that friction at the beginning. So by moving that to the backside now, the user can place the order, you've completed the order, you've gotten the revenue, and now you're asking them to make that decision. But it's more,
and they've already entered all the information you're going to need for the account anyway, and now it's more just clicking a button and agreeing to it.
Super streamlined. It's very much based on sort of modern practices and usability data. If you use any other sort of very forward-thinking platform, that this experience will seem similar. Very, very good improvement.
Yeah, and that's something that's interesting. There's really only one company that I know of that can really get away with forcing account creation, and that's Amazon. Like Amazon forces you to register, and they can get away with it. But really, I think most other sites can't do that. It is nice. It is indeed. So interesting. So let's ask this maybe, because I'm sure this is a question that comes up. I know we've attended trade shows together, and I'm always talking marketing, but I still overhear people talking about, hey, we're thinking about Magento 2. When should we switch? We've got some hesitations. So maybe outline first, who should be strongly considering Magento 2 right now? In a minute, we'll talk about who should potentially wait, but who should be looking at Magento 2 right now?
Anybody who's considering Magento as a platform, in my opinion, should be looking at Magento 2. So Magento 1 is now on an end-of-life schedule. It has less than 2.5 years before it will no longer be officially supported. And if you're going to make a platform investment, our recommendation would generally be that you look at staying with that platform for at least 3 to 5 years. And so already Magento is not going to support you for what I would consider to be a full platform lifecycle. So that's one big problem if you don't adopt Magento 2 today. The other thing would be that Magento 2 does give you all of these new technologies, improvements, support for newer, faster server features, things like that, that really mean it's a much more solid application in many ways for what a merchant really needs than Magento 1 was. If you're on Magento, I am not currently pushing merchants to transition. So if you're already on Magento, you're already on that platform, you're considering upgrading, but you're trying to decide, do I need to do it now? I don't think you need to do it now. You do still have that 2.5 years ahead of you. There's not immediate pressure to have to get off Magento 1. So you can stick with that, and you've still got some time to do that upgrade. I think you should be thinking about it and figuring out when does it make sense for your business. No pressure. I do think, though, if you're at a point where you need or want to upgrade for other reasons, maybe you want some of the benefits of Magento 2. Maybe you have new features you want to build out, or some other significant change that you are going to make that would mean doing a hefty chunk of development on your site anyway, then I think now is a good time to be looking at Magento 2. 6 months ago, when it first came out, I would have said, I would wait a little bit, give it some time, let some of the issues get ironed out, things like that. But now that we've had some time for Magento to stabilize, there's been a number of patches released. We're actually on 2.1 now. I think a lot of those initial issues have been ironed out. People have had a chance to get used to it, learn what it means to build on it. And so now's really a good time to be thinking about making that transition.
Yeah, because we still heard that quite a bit at IRCE and even at Imagine this year, people saying, I'm just going to wait a little while. Because that's kind of in a lot of ways, that's prudent thinking. Something is new, so I'm going to wait and let the bugs get ironed out. But really, and I know you guys are very rigorous, and you did say 6 months ago, because I remember it, people need to wait. But now you feel like we're past that point, and for a lot of people, hey, it's go time.
Right. It's not be in a hurry time yet, but neither do I feel like you need to really hang out.
Gotcha. What are some of the considerations that people need to be thinking about? So let's say that I am on Magento and I'm looking at making a serious investment in my site anyway, and so I should be thinking about Magento 2, or maybe I've been looking at getting onto Magento for the first time, so Magento 2 makes sense. What are some of the considerations they need to be thinking about, just in kind of preparing? And let's take I'm going from M1 to M2. Let's take that scenario first. What do people need to be thinking about? What considerations they need to be making prior to that switch?
So in the M1 to M2 scenario, you're going to want to look at how many of the integrations and extensions that you use are available for Magento 2, because the architecture is so different. The customizations that you used for Magento 1 won't just work with Magento 2. You need to have Magento 2 specific versions. And while the ecosystem is catching up, not everything that was available for Magento 1 is available for Magento 2 yet. So if there's a key integration you need, doesn't have a Magento 2 edition out, or there's a key set of extensions you use that aren't yet available in Magento 2 versions, you might want to wait a little bit, because you're going to have to pay for custom development if you do that today. But that's the thing you're going to want to pay attention to.
It does seem like that's really the speed of extensions being M2 ready that's been picking up. It seems like, to me anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the marketing side, we do a lot of Google Shopping. It's a lot of feed management extensions, and I'm in several of them all the time, and I've noticed like all of them now are pushing M2 compatible. We got the M2 version ready, and so it seems like the extension marketplace is really getting ready.
Yeah, I think it's getting much closer. We also have Magento has their great new Magento marketplace that's now available. So in Magento 1, we have Magento Connect, which was the official Magento repository for extensions. The problem with Magento Connect was that it was kind of free for all. Anybody could post an extension there. There wasn't really any kind of monitoring or control. Yeah, so you had many versions of essentially the same thing. You had unscrupulous vendors ripping off other vendors. You had people writing fake reviews. A lot of problems with quality and findability, figuring out what was there, was it any good. With the new marketplace that has come after the release of Magento 2, Magento is standing behind their offering a lot more. So with the marketplace, Magento is now doing code audits, and for their higher level technology partners, they're even doing a manual sort of review. So there's an initial automated review. There's now also a manual review that they're doing. So they're actually verifying quality of extensions. They're also curating the selection to some degree, where they're not going to allow too many extensions that do basically the same thing, so that it's clear. And then they're also working to prevent fraud and things like that, so that marketplace is sort of a reliable source for extensions. Magento Connect wasn't something you could really count on too much. Marketplace should be. So that's helpful in finding that that source of extensions. Back to kind of the M1 to M2, the other really big consideration is data, getting your data across between the platforms. So thankfully, Magento has released a data migration toolkit. So there's a whole sort of managed published process for how you can move your orders and your products and your customer records from your Magento 1 site into your Magento 2 site. That would be the other big thing, though, that you want to pay attention to and make sure that custom data is going to be handled well.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about M2.1 and what's new in the 2.1 improvements that are there over 2.0 and anything interesting to share there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Magento 2.0 largely represented the architectural improvements that I talked about earlier, the new checkout experience, the new admin, but mostly it was feature parity with Magento 1. Wasn't a whole lot new there in terms of independent features. Magento 2.1 is their first feature release, and we have a couple of big things that have come with Magento 2.1. The first is native support for Elasticsearch. So Elasticsearch is a robust search engine software that has become very popular in recent years. It's available in several different hosted solutions as well. So if you don't want to have to manage Elasticsearch yourself, there are other people you can pay to do that for you. And that's now natively integrated into Magento Enterprise with 2.1. So that's
and so your experience looking at native search and M1 sites versus M2, this is a pretty major improvement.
Yeah, because with Magento 1, you either had the native MySQL system, which is limited in its effectiveness, or you had an integration with Solr. And while Solr is a fine engine, it needs to be pretty heavily managed, and you have to pretty much own it yourself. You have to set it up, you have to have a server for it. Elastic is more modern, and it has better, because it has these sort of managed hosting solutions behind it, it has better opportunity for people to get on board who maybe don't have that dedicated in-house sysadmin who can manage, say, a Solr instance for you. So Elastic's really helpful there. The second and most significant feature that we see with 2.1 is a complete staging and preview functionality. So now with Magento Enterprise 2.1, you can schedule batches of changes into essentially marketing campaigns, and then you can preview what your site is going to look like the way that a customer would see it at any point in time in the future. So you can see what the site will look like with future pricing changes, future promotions, future content changes. You can schedule all these things out. You have a really beautiful timeline where you can see all the changes you have coming. And then your marketers can be proactively seeing what's going to happen with the site once they've sort of pre-set up all these things. There's a few other minor features, some improvements to Braintree, PayPal in-context checkout, which is really cool. Go Google that if you want to know more about it. But the staging in Elasticsearch are the really big pops with 2.1.
That's awesome. And so as you've been in developing quite a bit on M2, what are the things that you find yourself enjoying the most that may be worth mentioning for a merchant, without getting into developer speak, but anything you haven't mentioned yet that you enjoy the most?
It's definitely more structured and more consistent than Magento 1. Not that it doesn't have its quirks. Any large application is going to. It can't be completely perfect, but Magento 2 does a better job of implementing good patterns for things. So even recently, we were looking at some needs around payment tokenization for a particular payments provider. And in Magento 1, we would have had to build out all the infrastructure for that. In Magento 2, there's a generic sort of Magento Vault component that we can use that provides a lot of the framework we need to build tokenization support. And that's representative of many things where Magento's done a good job of identifying the components that will be needed for many customizations and making those available in a useful way, both in terms of the front end, now that they have a whole sort of theme library you can reference, and in the back end with the key modules that they have in place.
So let's talk a little bit about some of those quirks, because I think that could be helpful. And again, I don't want to get too deep into the development stuff, but are there any quirks that someone needs to be aware of, and maybe Magento should know so they can work on it, but anything that people need to be aware of, like, hey, this could be a sticking point for me as I'm looking at making the transition? Yeah,
so Magento 2, in the vein with sort of growing up, it's also a somewhat more complex application. There's definitely a reasonably steep learning curve there, which was true of Magento 1, but if you're a developer, you're going to have a new learning curve to go through. Magento 2 also...
So potentially doing the same thing in M2 that you did in M1 the first couple times you're going to have to invest in
Yeah,
learning,
there's-
figuring out how to do it, so you're going to be more inefficient.
To achieve those improvements in the architecture that they wanted to achieve, they needed to fundamentally change some of the ways that Magento really worked under the hood. And that needed to happen. There was no way to solve these big problems of upgradability, of extension conflicts without doing that. But it also meant sort of breaking with the past, which means everything you knew from the past is no good. So that's something. The front end has totally changed. There's a whole sort of built out, layered library now that is based on less, although Magento is in the process of moving that to the SAS CSS framework. That is something that front-end developers really have to learn. There's a fair amount more complexity there. There's quite a bit of changes in the JavaScript layer. So there are definitely some things that are different. Probably the most significant change that I've seen as I look in the ecosystem and that we've experienced that can bite people when you're first learning on your first couple projects is how to deploy it and how to set up a server. So Magento 2, while being sort of more enterprise aware, that also means it uses more advanced concepts for how it's set up and put out in the wild. And if you don't know what you're doing, you can really hose it up and cause it to perform poorly. It's not really Magento's fault in terms of the application. It's more knowing what to do with it. But Magento has also recognized that they need to streamline that process a little more. They need to document it better. And that they've targeted that as a specific point of improvement for 2.2, that deployment and knowing how to work with it as a developer is going to get even better. Yeah.
You talked about this a little bit, and you mentioned that you referenced it a second ago, but this idea of being really easy to upgrade. So now that if I'm on 2.1 now, get my new 2.1 project launched, and now when 2.2 or 2.3 comes out, what should that upgrade process look like? I know it's going to be different in every case a little bit, but how should that upgrade process look on Magento 2 versus Magento 1?
So in Magento 1, doing an upgrade was akin to almost a lightweight rebuild, because changes in the application very likely broke things that you didn't see. You almost needed to take your old Magento site, bring up a new instance of the new Magento version, and then sort of pull over all your data and all your custom code, and then test it very thoroughly to see what broke. And something probably did break, and not in an obvious area. And so that process was painful. With Magento 2, there's now a structured system around how the components of the application are managed using a technology called Composer, which has become very popular in the PHP world. So with Composer, now it's easier to pull changes in, for example, to get a new update in. And then secondly, because Magento 2 is using standardized interfaces to go between different components, it's much less likely that a change in one area will break a change in another area. So in Magento 1, all the components of the system were sort of snarled up in each other's business, right? They
again with the hand gestures,
right?
The snarled up in the business. That was perfect. I love that.
Whereas in Magento 2, you can think about it as each component has a very sort of standard set of definitions about how it's plugged into, and it plugs in a very clean way. So rather than being all wrapped up like a hairball, and if you saw a map of the dependencies in Magento 1, it looked like a hairball. It's now much cleaner, and Magento has committed to those common layers between components will stay consistent from within major versions. So as long as we're on Magento 2, those layers will stay consistent. And that means a lot of changes can happen inside of a component that won't break other components, because the way those other components interface stays the same. So all of those things lead to upgrades being much less likely to break components. With Composer now as package management and giving you a streamlined way to pull those in, we've already had to do a couple upgrades on projects that we have sort of midstream, and it's proved very seamless to pull that in, push the change out, test for things breaking, and you have much less of that happening than before.
That's great. So a couple of just kind of rapid fire questions as we have just a few minutes left in the show. Any M2 myths out there that need to be busted? Anything you hear that's like a rumor or someone that's fundamentally false about M2 that needs to be dispelled? And if not, that's okay. I'm putting you on the spot.
Some people say that it is slower than Magento 1. And we need to parse that a little bit carefully, because it is sort of simultaneously a truth and a myth.
Okay.
So the truth is that if you set up environments exactly the same between Magento 2 and Magento 1, say on PHP 5.6, with exactly the same resources, then what you see is that, yes, Magento 2 for straight up page requests is a little bit slower than Magento 1. Where Magento 2 really does get performance gains is in a couple of major areas. One is you have that native support for caching now. So Magento 1 didn't have that, and that is a real concrete improvement. The second is that Magento 2 has support for PHP 7. PHP 7 improves performance of PHP applications across the board by a significant margin, getting close to as much as 100% improvement for certain page loads. So because Magento 2 has native support from PHP 7, it's able to be put into an environment that is going to perform much more quickly than Magento 1. So if you want to be really specific from a technically accurate developer perspective, Magento 1 is maybe slightly faster. From a real world perspective, in terms of what's going to matter to most merchants for hosting costs and what's going to matter to customers in terms of the experience they actually get on the site, Magento 2 is going to be a fair bit faster and certainly much more scalable.
Nice, nice. I had a customer recently talk about even just updating their database and indexing and some of those things being much faster.
Yeah.
Into is that the case as well? Yeah.
What particularly happened? So the indexing that you referenced, Magento made a number of indexing improvements in Magento 1 for Magento 1 Enterprise Edition. That was another feature that was pulled from Magento 1 Enterprise down to both Community and Enterprise with Magento 2. So especially if you had someone who was using Magento 1 Community Edition before, now they've gone to Magento 2 Community Edition. They've picked up those indexing improvements that used to be Enterprise exclusive, and that's definitely going to help them see better performance.
Nice. Any peering into a crystal ball, any rumors about what's coming next with M2?
I can probably do a little bit better than rumors.
Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So it's some things that we know are on the roadmap. No specific promises in terms of time, but we know they're coming soon. First of all, Magento is working on a number of offerings around B2B. So there will be essentially a B2B add-on package for Magento with a number of key improvements to improve the value for B2B merchants using the Magento platform. B2B e-commerce is a big growth area right now. It's been a prominent area for Magento. So Magento is going to be rolling out native product offerings for that, and more details to come as we know more and as they publish more. The second thing that I'm really looking forward to is that they are targeting a lot of improvements to the content management system. So content management in Magento is a little weak. And they're looking at potentially both improvements to Magento's native content management features, and we've also heard some potential rumors about maybe integration with other content management systems. But that's very much rumor.
Okay.
I don't know anything, and wait until there is official word. But those are things that we hear about that we're looking forward to. On the content side specifically, I hope we get some specifics because that could be a good thing.
Awesome.
Content commerce plays are a big deal these days.
Huge, absolutely, very good. So, any just kind of as we wrap up, this has been fantastic. Any resources people should check out? I know several of the folks here at Classy Llama have written blogs, and there's one on some of the new features. Kind of runs through it. I know Zach Nanigan, a developer, wrote very nerdy, developer-friendly art. It was actually great. I didn't understand a lot of it, but it was good on what's familiar between M1 and M2. Other resources, other things people should check out?
In addition to that, there's 3 places that I recommend that people go. The first is to the Magento website itself. And within the Magento website, there are 2 key areas to check out. The first is their docs section. So they have now published the entire Magento user guide online. It used to be this PDF that was hard to find, and then it was like 300 pages long. Now it's a searchable, indexed, online reference, really useful for learning about features of the application. There's also the developer docs there. So you can learn all about how to develop and what the framework is, what the API is capable of doing, all now really accessible on docs.magento.com. The second thing would be the Magento forums on the Magento website. So they've rebooted the user forums, got rid of a lot of the old crap that was there. They're back. They're being managed again, and so that's a great place to go learn about features, get input, etc. So in terms of Magento website, those are great resources to check out. Then aside from that, I would say check out if you're more on the developer end, check out the Magento Stack Exchange. There's a lot of conversation happening there about Magento features technical stuff. And then finally, of course, Magento is developing Magento 2 out in the open on GitHub. So you can go to the Magento repository on GitHub, see issues, post comments, submit pull requests, make contributions. Those would be the key places.
Test it out, play around with it a little bit. There you go.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Rob Toll, everybody, Director of Solutions, Classy Llama. Rob, fantastic job. Excellent stuff. And so M2, I know it's a hot topic. Hopefully this sheds some light on the topic for those that are interested. And so as always, please let us know what you think. Give us some feedback on what you'd like to see more of, less of in the future. Also, leave us a review on iTunes. We would absolutely love that. And until next time, stay classy.